I'm Brenda, and this is Matt, and we are here to present on WSP trails today. So I was not on the overview presentation earlier in the week, so this was probably already covered, but just to let you know kind of where we are in the world of WSP element. So trails is one of the optional elements under the undeveloped quality of wilderness character section. And, you know, as Eric had said, there are 70% of the wilderness areas track trails as an element. The average score in FY20 was 3.9, which was up slightly from FY19. Region 3 had the highest score of a 5.4. So let me just go over a few key terms that you'll hear during today's presentation. So National Forest System Trail, what is that? Well, the very basic definition is that it's a route identified as a trail in, and I'm going to use this term, Nrm Trails Database. I learned. Thank you, whoever that was that brought that up during the last meeting. So that's basically our definition of a trail. It has to be in our InfraTrail database. And then trail assessment and condition survey is, we never say that term, we always say tracks. So you will hear that a lot as well. A track survey is basically, that's our required methodology for conducting trail condition assessments and inventorying the different structures out on a trail. And then the same trail management objective, pretty much never say it like that. It's always called TMO. And that is essentially a document that just summarizes the management intent for a trail and management direction. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that on another slide. And then user developed trail, that is pretty, that's a pretty basic thing. It's the opposite of a National Forest System trail. So a user developed trail is not one that we typically track in our NRM infra database, and it's not something that we go out and maintain to any specific standards. So it's typically an unauthorized trail that was just developed by people over time. So, oh, okay, I'm just gonna click through all these. So a TMO basically is, as I said, it's just documenting the management direction for that trail. So it tells you what, you know, the trail name and number, and then basically what uses are allowed, prohibited, discouraged. And then it also tells you, you know, the season of use typically. So if there are seasonal restrictions on use, if it's closed at a certain time, that would be documented in the TMO. And then also it'll just document kind of typically when is it open for hiking or for ATV use, that kind of thing. And it also contains the information about the design parameters. So the kind of the tread width of the trail, the clearing height. So what are those specifications for the trail based on the uses that it's managed and designed for, and the type of trail. So these 5 things are referred to as the trail fundamentals, or we call them TF in the business. No, I'm totally kidding. We really don't say trail fundamentals very often, but trail type is obviously a standard term that we use, and that's just basically, is it a snow trail or a water trail or just a dirt trail, a terra or standard trail? So those are the 3 trail types. Trail class, I have another slide on this, but essentially it's kind of the scale of development of the trail. So trail class 1 would be the most primitive. Trail class 5 would be typically, you know, a hard asphalt trail for accessible access use. And then managed use is, you can have several managed uses on a trail. It's basically what we're actively, the modes of travel that we're actively managing for. So for example, you could have a multiple use trail, but the managed use could be, let's say, bike use, right? But you might, okay, that's a bad example. You could have, I'm trying to think of one where you would have a managed use versus accept. So you could have, okay, well, let's do there's a hiking trail, that we we manage the trail for hiking use, but you can accept bike use, but we're not actively encouraging bikes to be on that trail. We're not actively designing the trail to be a bike flow trail. So it's really designed for hiking use, but bikes are accepted. So they're not specifically prohibited, but we're also not encouraging their use. So designed use feeds into the managed use piece, where the designed use is basically the design parameters of the trail. So again, like the trail grade, the tread width, clearing heights and widths, that kind of thing, that require the most demanding specifications. So it would be which managed use requires the most demanding specifications for that trail. A trail only ever has one designed use, but it can have many managed uses. And then the design parameters, I already said, that's like the, the clearing heights and widths and the tread width and the grades and slopes and all that kind of thing. So next, okay, so I had mentioned trail class before. So again, this slide is just showing the, the scale. So trail class 1 is the least developed, trail class 5 is the most. Within wilderness areas, your trail class is typically going to be class 1 and 2. Trail class 3, maybe trail class 4 may be present more in the transitional WROS class, where you're going into or out of the wilderness. It's those main portal trails. But otherwise, within designated wilderness are typically class 1 or 2. And one thing to note, trail class 1 is typically not for stock. So that has been an issue in the past. That was a concern when we came out with the trail class matrix. The backcountry horsemen were concerned that if we make it a trail class 1, they're effectively kind of meaning that they're not available for stock. So that's just something to be aware of. So another term that you'll hear, and again, this is in the TMO, the Wilderness Recreation Opportunity Spectrum, so WROS. And this is really just the way of, well, what it says here, just describing the kind of the setting. So it's similar to the Recreation Opportunity Spectrum, but specific to wilderness. And so this slide just talks about the different classes that are within wilderness. And again, usually it's the trail class 1 or 2 that would be within these WROS classes. So with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Matt.
Trails points are a little bit unique because most of the system, WSP system, is set to go 1 through 10 in sequential order. You have to earn the lower level points before you can earn the next level up points. But Trails is actually divided out into 2 different categories that you can do concurrently. So you've got your National Forest System trails for our managed trails that are in our system, as Brenda mentioned. And then we also have elements points for user developed trails, because we really need to manage both types of trails. They are very different in how you manage them in the wilderness. And so the split scoring gives you an opportunity to score some points, not necessarily in sequential order. Next slide, please. This just shows what it looks like in the Nrm database and how you rank your scoring. Obviously, the little pen and paper on the side is where you enter your documentation. And you just, again, points 2 through 6, it's similar. You work through it in a sequential order. And then same with user developed 2 through 4, you work through it in sequential order. Okay. So for the 2-point level, and the reason we had Brenda go over all that information pertaining to TMOs and trail class matrix and WROS is because if you look at the points, it all revolves around TMOs and how they relate to wilderness, if they're established, when you've last checked them, all that stuff. So that's why we gave you all that information up front, because for each of the points, you're going to be referring to TMOs for your system trails. And understanding the TMOs and the different components of it will help you understand or evaluate your trails, which is how you get your points for TMO compliance. So the 2-point level is just that TMOs have been established for the trails in the wilderness. So I don't remember the year. I want to say it was 2005, 2007. It became a requirement to put TMOs together for each of your trails. And we have done across the country, some forests have done a better job of getting those established than others. But at this point, we're doing pretty well across the country, and that most trails have TMOs established. One of the issues we're running into is we realized they created TMOs, they just never actually signed them. So they haven't really been official in our data yet. So it's kind of an interesting thing. and you can score points by sort of completing some of these processes. So if you read that, TMOs have been established for all the trails in the wilderness. The objectives have been reviewed when they're already in existence to determine if they're consistent with wilderness management objectives. So all that stuff that Brenda led out with, you've developed that TMO and you've evaluated what's in that TMO to make sure it's consistent with wilderness management. Next slide. So to move up to the 4-point level, you have done everything on the 2-point level, and then you've reassessed the conformance to the TMOs within the past 5 years, and the results were documented. The documentation piece is something that a lot of people sort of struggle with. They want to select this point, but they don't know when the last time they assessed the TMOs. And one of the things I noticed was, as my forest, the Daniel Boone National Forest, was partaking in wilderness character monitoring, which I think we're only in year 3. So not every forest has created their WCM baseline yet. That's another component of wilderness character, because trails falls under wilderness character, is that when you do WCM baseline, you sort of set yourself up to do a 5-year analysis of your TMOs and how you're managing your trails. So if people weren't sure the last time that their TMOs were evaluated, or no one's looked at them since they were signed in a binder and put on a shelf in 2007, then initiating WCM baseline will kind of set you on a 5-year rotation. And so that should help keep this point scale current. And you can always show that you did wilderness character monitoring in 2021, and that gives you a date, a hard date to set as documentation. And then it sets you up to review those every 5 years. Next slide. So management actions have been taken. So this gets you to the 6-point level. So you've got your TMOs established, you've reevaluated or evaluated your TMOs and your trails for conformance to the TMOs. And then you've decided that, hey, this trail needs X, Y, and Z done to it, or we need to adjust our TMOs based on the reality on the ground. So you've taken some sort of management action to get your trails to conform to the TMOs. That's basically it. If you are actively managing your trails in wilderness based on your TMOs, you can claim this 6-point level. And I think just from a documentation standpoint, a description of those management actions and the date or the year that those management actions were taken would give you the documentation needed for this point. Next slide, and we'll jump to user developed trails. So this one, looking at user developed trails is always sort of a tricky thing in the agency. Some people like to just kind of put their head in the sand and ignore some of these user developed trails. But WSP really rewards those forests that take a hard look at their user trails out in the wilderness areas. I think it was prior to 2019, there was not a specific protocol for how you survey your user developed trails. The Forest Service worked with Oregon State University. I believe it was published in 2019. I could be wrong on that. But we now have a documented minimum protocol for your survey of user developed trails. It's available in the WSP guidebook. There's links in there to it. It's the minimum. You don't have to necessarily use this protocol. You can develop your own if you want, but now that we have a set protocol out there, that keeps people from having to reinvent the wheel. So that's a nice feature. On another option out there, if any forests have gone through a limits of acceptable change protocol, that could also be used for how you document your user developed trails. So there's other options out there, but there is a set, a minimum protocol available now. Next slide. So I think this is probably the hardest one on all of these to claim, but to get the 4 points for user development, a management plan to address user development's been developed and is being implemented. So that's a lot. Again, like I said, a lot of forests like to put their head in the sand when it comes to user developed trails. So to actually step out, develop a management plan, and actually implement that management plan for user developed trails is going to be a big reach for some forests, but it's one that's worthwhile undertaking. We're doing this again on the Daniel Boone for the Clifty Wilderness right now with our Red River Gorge Wilderness Management Plan. It just gives us a framework. We know what's out there. We have an idea of how we want to manage it. Are we going to try and get rid of some of these trails? Are we going to try to adopt some of these trails into the system? And so going through that effort, it is a big effort, but it gives you that framework for moving forward and figuring out how to better manage these user-developed trails in wilderness. And again, a plan like that's going to have a sign date and start to be implemented upon. So there's your documentation there. Next slide. I think that's the bulk of the presentation right there. So we're happy to open it up to questions and go from there.
All right, if anybody has any questions, please go ahead and add those to the chat box. Yeah, we have about 70 people in here, so let's go ahead and use the chat box for now. If anybody has any questions, please put them in there. I will add the SharePoint site into the chat box as well here. I did see that someone asked. So Matt did reference the WSP guidebook. As I noted in the chat box, it is available on the SharePoint site for WSP, but it's also on Wilderness Connect. So that way people that don't have access through the internal firewalls can still access that guidebook on the Wilderness Connect. All right, any questions to post? While you're thinking of questions, I am going to go ahead and put the survey in the chat box as well. So this is a survey just for the session. Looks like you were going to say something, Matt, and I cut you off.
I was just going to add that while I've been fortunate enough to manage trails and several in wilderness for a long time, my exposure to wilderness and WSP is fairly recent, and I just wanted to put a plug in for the great resources that are out there, including yourself, Eric, as well as the folks over at SAWS. We get to work with them here in the southern region, and they are just a phenomenal resource, both in on-the-ground management, but just information. I know they've helped me out. I've only been managing wilderness, or I've only had that under my focus for the last year, a little bit more, year plus, and they've been just been a tremendous help for me getting up to speed on wilderness management, wilderness character, WSP, all the different components. So there's a lot of good resources out there.
Yeah, and I'll also just say, if any of you are on the previous session where I gave just a really whirlwind overview of the trail program and kind of what's on our list, I'm happy to continue that conversation or answer any questions or address any comments you have on that as well.
Yeah, definitely. We have definitely plenty of time. So if you were on the previous session and didn't get a chance to answer some questions, I know we had to cut that one off a little short, possibly. So if you have any overall questions about trails program, this is a great time to do it. So I'm going to throw out a question to you just because the last time I saw the numbers, I'm just wondering where you things are at. So with Jeff Mast and I always had to mess around with each other a little bit. So I was always proud of the fact that of the TMOs, that wilderness trails were leading non-wilderness trails in established TMOs. I was wondering if that's still the case.
That's a good question. I don't know about that one. I'll have to look into that.
I haven't checked the numbers, but I would almost bet money that's still the case, and that's probably a lot of thanks to WSP and what was the original Wilderness 10-year challenge. And now General Trails is kind of following your guys' footsteps with another 10-year challenge, and hopefully we'll increase some of our TMOs and just our data and trail management efforts.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Any last chances for questions to be added to the chat?
Or even if there's just anything you want us to know about, anything that should be on our radar of what you're dealing with, good or bad on the ground. We'd love to hear from you. I guess we're too intimidating, Matt. I guess that's what it is.
I'll ask questions. I don't mind. And I have no problem putting you on the spot a little bit. So, one of the things you mentioned was the Trails Advisory Group. And it is a great opportunity. It's a fairly newer group, like you said, kind of formulated following the Wilderness Advisory Group concept. Similar to Wilderness Advisory Group, Trails Advisory Group had a great opportunity to have a one-on-one with the chief. And I know Matt kind of led that opportunity. Did you have anything specific you wanted to share from that visit?
I'll just say that those visits are just an awesome opportunity, and it's really cool if you're a WAG or a TAG rep to get an opportunity to have a sit down one-on-one with the chief of the Forest Service. This year and last year, obviously, it's been a little weird being virtual, but actually last year we were able to squeeze in our face-to-face right before everything cracked down. We had our last face-to-face in February during Hike the Hill event. So for those of you out there that manage trails or manage wilderness, having the opportunity to participate in one of those groups is just, it's an awesome opportunity. It gives you a great network of people to connect with regarding trails or wilderness. It gives you a little more insight into how things are done, managed across the country, and making those connections of being able to call somebody up from a different region and say, hey, I'm dealing with this. How are you guys dealing with it? It's just a great resource. And it's also really invigorating when you realize that you're not sort of out there on an island doing this management on your own. That's the way it felt for me in trails before I got involved in the Trails Advisory Group. And it was really fun to get together with people from all over the country and realize that we're all really dealing with a lot of similar issues. Yeah, regions vary and issues vary. And, trail conditions and types vary, of course, soils and terrain and all that. But we really deal with a lot of similar issues. So again, making those connections has been great. But specifically to our last meeting with the chief, it was really, it's always exciting when you have that opportunity to speak with leadership and they really take notice of something and they ask questions and they want to know more information. And this year, the big one for us was the seasonal hiring. So we raised the red flag that the seasonal hiring practices right now are really not working for trails and recreation staff due to the timing primarily, and then the limitations on it. And it was really nice to get a good conversation around that and some feedback that they basically said, well, this is great for us to know. We built this basically for fire, and this is something that we can probably remedy. So that's super exciting that, basically a group of 9 field going folks that work out in the dirt can raise an issue and have leadership take notice and say, well, this is something we can fix. We're still in the process of follow-up meetings on how we're going to fix it. But, I think wilderness and wilderness techs and rec techs of all kinds, we're all dealing with the same issue with the current hiring situation being so limited on timing and sort of in the batch hiring process. And what we're noticing, one of the big issues that we're having is when people get new jobs, and this happens a lot in the rec tech and trail tech fields, they leave a void behind. And so if you get somebody that's poached off your forest and they go to another forest or a different agency in April or May and the hiring window is closed, you're now left with this hole and no real way to fill it. So we're really hopeful that we can develop, whether it's going back to open continuous recruitments or some other process that will allow for more flexibility on filling those voids. I think that will help the trails, recreation, wilderness crews out there be more flexible and get those positions filled that are really critical to how we manage our trails, wilderness, and interact with the public.
Great, thanks, Matt. You got a positive comment on that one from a seasonal worker. So I just wanted to let you know. So I appreciate your time. If there's no more questions I see popping up, we'll go ahead and wrap it up for today. I really appreciate Matt and Brenda, your time today. As Brenda noted, we have 32,000 miles of the trail system that occurs within our wilderness areas, and who knows how many miles of user-developed trails. So the wilderness trails connectivity is huge. We work very well together, very close together, and I appreciate your partnership from a work perspective, but then also just for your participation today.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone.